You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 17th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. It's 10 a.m. in Moscow, 8 a.m. in Paris, 7 a.m. here in London and 3 a.m. in Washington, D.C. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, we shall respond to the escalation by escalating. Houthis vow to retaliate after Washington launches strikes against targets in Yemen. Also coming up...
If Putin is serious about peace, it's very simple. He has to stop his barbaric attacks on Ukraine and agree to a ceasefire. And the world is watching.
The coalition of the willing comes together, but what did this weekend's virtual get-together of national leaders achieve? And does it show commitment to paying for and ensuring security for Ukraine? And
green hushing, which I didn't think much about. We see a lot of clients basically doing that. People in many cases don't want to talk about it at all. They're still doing it. They just don't want to talk about it.
How changing narratives on sustainability are impacting the US real estate industry. Plus the papers, the design news comes from Paris, and we'll find out why young people are the biggest buyers of the Bible. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. A 7-day period of mourning has been declared in North Macedonia after 59 people died in a fire at a nightclub. The US has deported more than 250 mainly Venezuelans to El Salvador using a rarely invoked 18th century law. And Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney is making his first foreign trip in office to visit the UK and France. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has said that American forces will launch unrelenting strikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen until they stop targeting shipping in the Red Sea. Over the weekend, the US launched air raids on Houthi positions. The Houthi militia in Yemen has vowed to retaliate. Well, joining me now is Julie Norman, lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL. A very good morning to you, Julie. Welcome back to The Globalist.
Thanks. Good morning.
The irony here is that the Houthi rebels, had said that they had paused their attacks on shipping because of the Gaza ceasefire.
That is right. So the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea were a major problem last year from shortly after the start of the Gaza war and after October 7th. Over 100 attacks on commercial vessels, another over 100 attacks on military vessels. But the Houthis had always said they were doing those while the war was continuing, and that once there was a ceasefire, those attacks would stop. And to their credit, when the ceasefire went into effect in January, those attacks did indeed stop. We hadn't seen one in several months. They were threatening to restart those attacks due to the halt on humanitarian aid into Gaza that is now in effect from Israel in the last week or two. But again, no attacks since January. So the U.S.'s framing of this as bombing them until they halt their attacks feels a little bit off in terms of sequencing because the attacks had halted, at least for the moment.
So there's unconfirmed reports this morning that the Houthis have said that they've launched missiles and a drone strike at the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier. So not to be at this moment that needs to be verified, but it does suggest that whatever the US tried to do over the weekend perhaps had the opposite effect.
Well, that's right. And, it's something that was somewhat expected, I would say, if there is a group that has paused its hostilities, if they are attacked, then that's certainly going to motivate them to restart them. And I think that's what we're seeing. Again, I would note that there were numerous strikes on Houthi positions under the Biden administration also. Occasionally in accordance with the UK as well, and also Israeli strikes. So this isn't the first time they've been hit, that there's been retaliation. But again, this particular moment coming when there has been a pause, I do think we'll just escalate it again and probably get these attacks starting again, if more than they were in the past.
The wider issue here is Donald Trump and his message to Iran, isn't it? And he has in the past said he'll hold Iran wholly accountable if they don't stop supporting the Houthis. He's exerting maximum pressure to force Iran to come to the table with regards to nuclear, to any kind of nuclear deal.
That's right. So I think this is where, where we should be situating these actions from the U.S. It's not just solely against the Houthis or so much in relation to Gaza, as much as Trump's current efforts to try and put maximum pressure on Iran, trying to force some kind of negotiation again over the nuclear deal, which, again, Trump had pulled out of in his first term. But I think there's just a little bit of a mismatch here. I mean, the Houthis are supported to some degree by Iran, but this is not a very simple that the Houthis just do whatever Iran tells them kind of thing. So I think this idea of, we'll bomb the Houthis and that'll get Iran to the table is not really where the leverage is here.
The interesting thing, though, is that there's as you mentioned, that a mismatch is that Donald Trump has, since day one of his second term, said that he is a president who wishes to stop conflict. So why is he suddenly launching attacks on the Houthis?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, this is one reason why I think even for people not following the Middle East, why this initial attack was important is because the one thing people have said about Trump is he's, reluctant to use military force. He's really leaning into economic coercion, et cetera. And that is what we've seen in other parts of the world. But here we really did see this willingness to obviously use military force, escalate it beyond what was being done on this particular issue in the past. And so I do imagine this is the kind of pattern we'll see in the future, where when there are specific instances where the U.S., feels they can make some kind of point or gain without putting their own troops in indirect threat or in some kind of dangerous position, we will maybe see Trump do this, and are probably likely to see it even more.
Where do you think he might go next then?
I mean, I don't want to speculate too much on where force would be used. I mean, I would say, again, for the U.S., the positions have been there throughout the region since October 7th. One can even say pre-October 7th, but that's really where I think the U.S. has been most prepared to respond. And we have seen them, intervene over the last year in very kind of restrained ways. And so that's still where I would say the military focus is right now. But again, with Trump, I do think we need to be aware that this is one of the cards that he can and will play in this context as well as others.
From the Iranian point of view, it's been made quite clear over the last couple of days that they do not have direct control over what the Houthis do. The Houthis have one of the few allied groups which have retained their power in the last few months. You're just thinking of the depletion of force of Hezbollah in Lebanon. But it's not as complicated as Iran just ringing up the Houthi rebels and saying, you will stop this now, otherwise we'll stop supporting you.
That's exactly right. I think there's sometimes an impression that acts of resistance groups, so-called Iran proxies, are just that proxies for Iran, when in fact they're more a network of groups that do receive backing, financing, training, what have you from Iran, but do work with a very high level degree of autonomy. And we've certainly seen that with the Houthis. With that said, I would point out last year around this time, the Biden administration was successful in getting Iran to pressure some of its backed groups in Iraq and elsewhere from some of the hostilities they were engaging with, and they were able to do that through back channels. I don't think that'll be quite as easy with the Houthis, but my sense is that's what the U.S. thinks they're going to be able to do here. But I don't see that kind of again influence and over the Houthis from Iran as much as I think the U.S. thinks there is.
How much do the Iranians need the Houthis?
Well, it's been interesting. I mean, the Houthis were not a major player in the region until pretty recently. I mean, there were a rebel group who took control over parts of Yemen back in 2014, but it was really just in this last year in the context of the Gaza war that they asserted themselves as this, regional resistance power with these strikes in the Red Sea. Right now, Iran is very weak from the events over the last year, but especially the fall of the Syria regime as well. Hezbollah is very weak. So right now, I would say the Houthis are one of the stronger groups in the region, and probably one that, Iran, even if they could rein them in, is probably is not looking to do that.
How much do this weekend's attacks change the balance of what is happening in that part of the world? Given the fact that, sorry, carry on.
I do think it opens up again this possibility of regional escalation, which has always been there. I think since the ceasefire, even though things within Gaza remain extremely grim, extremely uncertain, this worry about a regional escalation had eased at least a little bit, I would say, in the last few months, and I think that's back on the table now with the U.S. strikes, with the likely Houthi retaliations, and again the overall Iran tensions in the background.
Julie Norman, thank you so much for joining me on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. It's 9:10 a.m. in Kyiv, 7:10 a.m. here in London. Now, the British Prime Minister took centre stage this weekend in the latest round of global diplomacy for Ukraine. Sir Keir Starmer urged world leaders to ramp up the pressure on Moscow. He said that the so-called Coalition of the Willing, an international alliance of nations who've gathered together after Donald Trump stepped in with negotiations with Russia, he said they should put more robust plans in place in order to, what he said was to swing in behind a peace deal and to guarantee Ukraine's future security. Well, I'm joined now by Jenny Mathers, who's Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University. A very good morning to you, Jenny.
Good morning.
So just recap for us what happened on Saturday. It was, a 2-hour-long meeting, some 25 national leaders taking part. What was said?
So this was an interesting development because, Keir Starmer convened this meeting, which was a virtual meeting, so much more efficient than trying to drag everybody, to London. But basically, what they're doing is they're looking at two dimensions, really, of this stage of the war. One is preparing for some kind of a peacekeeping force to be on the ground, so soldiers on the ground in the event of some kind of an agreement coming forward from Russia and Ukraine. But secondly, they're also looking at how to put more pressure on Russia to comply with the suggestion of a ceasefire, to go into peace negotiations with a more kind of open and genuine approach to it, rather than just insisting that Russia should get its own way. So this is, or I suppose maybe a third dimension would be the PR dimension, demonstrating to Russia and to the wider world that there is a group of countries, and a sizable group of countries, not only in Europe, who are willing to stand up to Russia and sort of defend Ukraine in various ways.
These are hugely important moments and enormous projects of which you speak. But what level of detail do we actually have?
Well, there was talk about increasing sort of sanctions and putting more economic pressure on Russia. There's growing concern about the so-called sort of shadow fleet of Russian Russian ships that are operating under different flags, that are sort of getting around sanctions, possibly damaging cables in the North Sea and so on. So it was these kinds of arrangements that we know about, and also just the fact that they're talking about numbers of troops that might go on the ground, who might supply them, and how that might work.
This is all happening very quickly, isn't it? It's only, a couple of weeks since we started to talk about the so-called Coalition of the Willing. And how quickly can people come together?
Well, I think it's a matter of two things. One is political will, and at the moment there seems to be quite a bit of political will, driven to a large extent by the fact that Donald Trump seems to have put his weight behind Russia rather than Ukraine, and that is really mobilizing people and focusing their attention. So I think with sufficient political will, a lot of things could be done quickly. There's also, of course, logistical issue around particularly things like deploying troops, how many would be available, who would provide them, what sort of arrangements there might be for, what happens if there is a ceasefire or peace treaty violation and so on. And those kinds of logistical details will take more time just to work everything out and to make sure all of the arrangements are in place. So I think as long as the political will is there, it is a matter of time in terms of whether or not these things can happen.
One goes back to the long question of how Europe readies itself for this, because it needs to be ready for this. I mean, we've only seen commitment from the British and the French to offer to send troops. So there is that pressure on Europe that it needs to be ready.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly some countries like Poland and Italy have indicated that they're not willing to send troops. But of course, there might be other things that they could do in terms of of financial and logistical support that would be valuable. So yes, I think although things are moving at pace, it is still going to take a little bit of time for the various members of this coalition to get to grips with the changed reality on the ground and the fact that there probably is not going to be a U.S. backstop behind any agreement that might be made between Russia and Ukraine. And I think that is the really the key point is can this coalition of the willing do it without the Americans?
Which then sort of makes us look at Donald Trump. And he has yet to say whether the United States will offer the support needed to ensure that any mission succeeds. We've got Keir Starmer this weekend saying that they're talking every single day, the UK and the US. We've got the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, over there on Friday. Just trying to pin the US down on the backstop is actually everything. Is ultimately what this has all got to be about, isn't it?
Well, that is certainly Plan A, is for an American backstop. And without that, then Plan B becomes a lot more difficult to achieve. So I think, there's a lot of emphasis on desperately trying to get the Americans to step behind this, whatever plan comes to fruition in a very meaningful way. The problem, of course, is that, everything that Trump has done and said since the 20th of January suggests that his sympathies lie with Russia and not with Ukraine, and that he's not interested in providing support, military support or other kinds of support for any kind of a ceasefire beyond some sort of a minerals deal and perhaps having some American workers in Ukraine. So it looks like there's quite a long way to go before the Trump administration might be amenable to this idea of providing a backstop. And
we have Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin expected to talk in the coming days. It is as it stands, far from certain that Russia will sign up to the 30-day ceasefire that was suggested last week.
Exactly. I mean, so far, all Russia has said is that, in principle, yes, sounds like a good idea, but let's talk about practical details and then provide a whole load of stumbling blocks in the way. So I think we still have a very long way to go, even though there's a lot of talk about this, even though everybody's gearing up for it and getting ready for it. Absolutely, there's no guarantee that Moscow will agree.
There are extra areas to explore, though. Further sanctions, one wonders what effect they could have.
Well, I think the fact that the Russians have been so keen to reestablish economic links with the United States is an indication that, economic sanctions have been having an impact and that Russia wants to get rid of them. Of course, the problem with sanctions is that if the U.S. breaks from the rest of the pack and decides to drop its own sanctions, then remaining sanctions by other countries are going to lose a lot of their impact.
Talking just finally about the leading voices on all this, we saw the meeting on Saturday being led by the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. As we mentioned before, the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, sort of Tony Blair's right-hand man, has been out in Washington. He's also been working with the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky. There is this new, fresh moment, isn't there? Is there that the United Kingdom is taking the lead?
Yes, and I think, this is an opportunity, given the vacuum which Trump has kind of created by stepping back from the way that the Biden administration approached the war in Ukraine. The fact that Keir Starmer has stepped up indicates that sort of opportunity for Britain to play perhaps a unique role, leaning on this tradition of a special relationship, trying to be the intermediary where other countries perhaps might have struggled to do that. So it is an opportunity, and it might also, indicate a turn towards a much more pro-European kind of, at least for security issues, arrangement for Britain after Brexit.
Jenny Mathers, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
There's lots of different ways to think about regulation and climate. What it really comes down to is we know from the work we're doing that you can drive a financial outcome, but also drive a climate outcome at the same time. That there's not a choice between the two, but they're co-benefits of one another.
Brad Docker, CEO and co-founder of Green Generations, will tell us a little later on why reaching net zero sometimes needs a little help. Stay with us.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. we know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:20 here in London. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio, Yossi Meckelberg, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House and a regular around this microphone table, I should say. How are you, Yossi? Welcome.
I'm well, thank you. Good to be here. How are you, Emma?
Very well, thank you. How was the weekend?
It was nice, uneventful, though. On Friday, we're invited. This a Festival of Colors in Hindu. Festival of Color, and also the beginning of the Sikh calendar. So I had a big celebration with neighbors, and a lot of color was thrown at us and all the clothes, and it was... The kids enjoyed it immensely, obviously, being of color, but we had enjoyed very much the food.
Yes, it's at one moment when you just work out, who is this for? Is this for the people who are in charge of doing the washing? It's a wonderful, wonderful festival. They're absolutely glorious. Take part of it in it if
Absolutely.
you can. Absolutely do it. Right, let us bring ourselves back to serious, deadly matters. We go back to Gaza. More particularly, you wanted to take us to Israeli domestic politics this morning.
Yeah, it's colorful too, but for all the wrong reasons. So we knew that the tension between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the head of the internal security, the Shabak, Shin Bet, was mounting, especially because the internal security, Shin Bet, is investigating some, how should I put it, security breaches in the Prime Minister office. That might lead eventually to some indictment. And Netanyahu doesn't like it because it's the people that are investigated are very close to him, and it might end also with him doing certain things that he should not do. And so he decided to fire the head of the Shabak, Ronen Bar. We all know that Ronen Bar, at one point or another, he said himself he will go. He was the head of the internal security on October 7. So the entire security system took responsibility. The only one not to take responsibility is the Prime Minister, and of course his cabinet. So what Netanyahu is doing now is trying to get rid of all the gatekeepers of Israel democracy. The head of the military already resigned, was replaced by someone more convenient. For Netanyahu, he tried to get rid of the Attorney General, and now it's the case of the head of the Shin Bet.
And in terms of its operation in Gaza, the fact remains is that Shin Bet and its leader take and its chief take a very, very active role, given the fact that Shin Bet is effectively is the country's security agency.
Especially internally, it's Gaza, it's the West Bank, it's even beyond that. And the last things that the organization needs is another upheaval. The Shin Bet is also involved in the negotiation over releasing the hostages. And it deliberately sidelined Ronen Bar, who's everyone that knows him told me that he's highly professional. Yes, the mistake of October 7 probably will haunt him for the rest of his life. But first and foremost, it was responsibility of the Prime Minister, the cabinet. Now, that's what we see is trying to undermine Israel democracy. It's the judiciary. He fired the defense minister, Yoav Gallant. Then comes, the Attorney General. Now, the interesting thing about that, because of this investigation, there is a conflict of interest. The next thing that the Attorney General that he wants to fire too told him, you can't do that. So this is going to end in the courts, probably in the Supreme Court, and I doubt if it's the Supreme Court will allow it to happen.
Let's move to the United States and to how the operations and the policies and the decisions being made in Washington are now very much touching the lives of every single day in America.
This is interesting. It's an article in the FT today about the state of consumerism in the United States, and we saw strong drop in people basically going to the shops. There is a way, because we keep transmitting through our mobile phones, so you can actually tell who is going to a shopping mall and shop or not. And we see decline of 4.3% of people actually physically going to shops. You might argue then they shop online, but this is not the case. And it's one thing to have a nationalist bravado about increasing tariffs and fighting a trade war with the entire world. It really makes people worried about whether they should go and spend. And we know American economy, as most of the liberal democracy, capitalist countries, they are based on consumerism, not necessarily just on manufacturing. And if people stop buying, and we'll see a decline of few percent already, and this is even before the tariffs, they can feel it in the shops. And you go famous brands, those who know the United States, like Target or One Buy or Walmart, already see decline in shopping across the board.
This article in the Financial Times talks about just how important consumer spending is when it comes to the US economy. It was, says the FT, one of the great things that propelled the US out of the COVID pandemic, apparently by all accounts outpacing almost everybody else. So when you have this volatility, when you have worries about what Donald Trump is going to do in terms of policy and sort of any kind of continuation of policy approach, this does not bode well for America, does it?
No, and again, this nationalist bravado of raising tariffs, it means you raise 25%. At the end of the day, at least some of it will have to be paid by the consumer. And when the economy is so much relying on people go and shop, and it's the day-to-day thing, and sometimes we tend to think that shopping in the United States is cheap. Is not. When it comes to food, for instance, it's expensive and other thing, but it's enough for people, for instance, delaying by 6 months changing their mobile phone or their laptop or some, and then you see a decline. And as you mentioned, in an economy that relies so much on consumerism, you will see the result. And it's interesting. President Trump came on the idea that, we need to reduce inflation, but he pushes inflation up. And he's already admitted last week we might get into recession. Again, he does it in a very flippant way, like recession is something that doesn't affect people. It means that losing a lot of jobs in the United States in case it enters into a recession.
Finally, a quick look in a matter of seconds, if you wouldn't mind, Yossi, because we're heading towards the news at the bottom of the hour. The New York Times has a brilliant article about Greenpeace, the great organisation which has campaigned for the environment for decades. We have all grown up with it. Yeah. It is saying that it is under threat now from a lawsuit.
Yeah, and this is an organisation that celebrated only 2 years ago its 50th anniversary and really changed the way that we look on environmental issues, created this awareness way before most of us discussed this, but it's also find that it's on the receiving end of a lawsuit of $300 million in the United States for supporting basically indigenous people in their fight against a pipeline that goes through their land. And the company from North Dakota that decided to sue them knows that it's not only whether they win or lose this lawsuit, it's the cost, the legal cost of it, that might actually bring down Greenpeace in the United States.
Yossi Mickelberg, thank you so much as ever for joining me in the studio. The time here in London is 7:28 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. A 7-day period of mourning has been declared in North Macedonia after 59 people died in a fire at a nightclub. It's understood that sparks from onstage pyrotechnics hit a ceiling, which was made from highly flammable material. Hospitals in Greece, Bulgaria and Serbia are treating some of the 150 people injured. The US has deported more than 250 mainly Venezuelans to El Salvador using a rarely invoked 18th century combat law. The deportations took place despite a federal judge's order to halt the flights. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he wanted to express his gratitude to El Salvador's president. And Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is making his first foreign trip in office to visit the UK and France. The Prime Minister's office said the aim of the trip is to strengthen two of our closest and longest-standing economic and security partnerships. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Pushing 7:30 here in London. Let's hear of another story that Monocle is keeping its attention on. Here's Julia Lassica to tell us about Portugal's stance on purchasing fighter jets from the United States.
Depending on who you ask, Lockheed Martin's F-35 Lightning II program has been US air power's biggest success story of the past 2 decades. Or, as aviation expert Bill Sweetman recently put it, a $1 trillion train wreck. Orders for the aircraft continue to roll in from air forces across the globe. But the wind might be turning. Last week, Portugal's Defence Minister Nuno Melo suggested that his country should reconsider buying any more F-35s, citing concerns around Donald Trump's commitment to European security. Some defence experts have warned that the plane's long-term operational capabilities would be hampered if the US were to stop sending parts and updates for the plane to other nations. In recent weeks, rumours have also circulated about a kill switch built into F-35s, which, according to a German arms manufacturer, the US could use to remotely disable the aircraft. Lockheed Martin denies the existence of such a function. For now, Portugal is reportedly considering buying planes built closer to home instead, such as the Eurofighter Typhoon, developed by the air forces of the UK, Germany, Italy and Spain, or France's Dassault Rafale. A similar change of heart by more European nations would provide a big boost to the continent's arms manufacturers, a result that Trump won't appreciate, but has unwittingly encouraged.
That was Monocle's Julia Lassica there. For more from our editors and correspondents, sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute. Just go to monocle.com/minute. We return to Cannes now to MIPIM, the world's largest convention for the property market. One topic on the agenda was how the industry can meet sustainability targets while still maintaining profitability. Monocle's editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck caught up with Brad Doxer, CEO and co-founder of Green Generation, a company that works with investors and governments to decarbonise and comply with regulations. Andrew began by asking Brad what his business was trying to achieve.
There's lots of different ways to think about regulation and climate. What it really comes down to is we know from the work we're doing that you can drive a financial outcome, but also drive a climate outcome at the same time. That there's not a choice between the two, but they're co-benefits of one another. And so today the business is really working and acting globally for investors and governments in Asia, India, Europe, and North America on how to profitably decarbonize, how to profitably address regulation in this clean energy or climate transition. We're really not policy people, we're really execution people. So we do everything from enterprise level strategy to asset level strategy, but what we're known for particularly is basically working at the asset level to come up with, net zero plans or decarbonization plans and then actually executing. Investors today, what they really want is they want to see changes to the financial value of the asset so that the asset's worth more, their fees are higher, their carried interest or profit participation is higher, but they can also get this climate return. We're working on one company right now in Europe for a client where they're getting ready to go to market and sell it, but they want a more robust decarbonization plan, both at the asset level, so all the assets, as well as the organizational level, so they can hand that to the buyer. They think that will lead to a better outcome in terms of sales, a higher price, faster, because there's a roadmap now for any buyer to address all the climate regulation that exists across the EU.
It's a fast-moving environment for what's being demanded in the EU and in lots of countries. It's a fast-moving world in how energy is generated. The cost of energy fluctuates wildly. How easy is it to say to somebody who has an asset, okay, here's a plan that is going to allow you to decarbonize and make greater profits? And these variables, we see the price of gas. We see the viability of solar rise and fall almost on a daily basis, it sometimes feels like. How easy is that for you as the key partner in that process?
It's a challenge. I mean, I think you point out sort of the volatility of a lot of commodity prices. Gas, if you looked at, across Europe, the volatility of gas prices has been enormous in the last couple of years. But the trend in most places is while there's volatility, certainly in electricity, the price is trending higher. And volatility is not the friend of the real estate owner because they spend so much time trying to drive the top line. Whether it's a hotel, get more rate or more occupancy, they need lower volatility on a lot of the costs. But I think what more than anything else, a lot of the clients we have don't have a vision that the work we do or the type of work that groups like us do is valuable in the sense that they think it's a commodity. They think, every report is the same, every net zero is the same, every decarb plan is the same. And when they start to work with us, they start to realize, in fact, it's not fungible. There's a great deal of variability in the quality and really the actionability of the work they're doing. And that's why most of the leading investors around the world, work with us in different places because they've come to understand that we drive value and we do it at speed because they're not long-term holders in most cases. So they need to know with certainty that you're going to do it and that it gets done, long before they go to sell it or have some sort of capital event.
Just tell me, in the US, we're seeing a slight change of rhetoric around what it means to be sustainable, whether it matters as much, and all sorts of conversations about drill, baby drill, as the phrase we're hearing a lot. You're based in the US, you're anchored there. Does it change the narrative for you at all, or do you think this is now so baked into the system and that people want it as well, that that in many ways we will continue on this path to decarbonisation?
It's interesting. About half our team lives, works, or has citizenship outside the U.S., but we are still, if you will, a U.S.-centric firm. My home is Washington, D.C., so I'm perhaps, a little more sensitive to all of this. But what we've seen more than anything else with the change of administration and change in priorities is that the federal government in the U.S. is simply one of perhaps a dozen stakeholders. There's also cities and states that have led this in the United States. We've got countries around the world. The corporate level, a lot of companies are talking differently about it. They're afraid to talk about DEI or talk about net zero, but they're still doing the same work. They're just talking about it very differently. Why? Because their employees care, their customers care, they're having to report on supply chain, or they're in somebody else's supply chain in scope 3 that they're having to do it, and their investors care, both on the equity side and the debt side. So I think it's caused us to think a little bit differently about the business. We've used different words. You'll be hard-pressed to find the word ESG on our website or in anything we're delivering today, but that's really driven by our clients not wanting to use the ESG term. They're still doing the same work because they know it's profitable, because they know that decarbonization done correctly will drive the value of their assets and their business. And the one thing that is quite certain in the U.S. and around the world is, profits are still in. Nobody's against profits. It may still be somebody out there who is against profits, but right now that's what's driving everything. And we've demonstrated time and time again that decarbonization, net zero, and addressing climate change is a profitable part of the business.
So, final note for people listening in, you remain positive, highly positive, that actually because it is driven by profit, and that when people see the opportunity to maybe do some good but actually just make more money, that this will carry us through this moment.
I think so. And certainly, outside the U.S., even in the U.S. and cities and states, this is not a choice. You see in New York, Boston, Washington, avoided costs, big fines if you're not doing benchmarking, if you're not meeting certain energy intensity standards. That's certainly the case across Europe. In Western Europe, the governments tend to be ahead of the EU. In Eastern Europe, the EU tends to be ahead of them. But they're all pushing. They're all pushing hard. It improves the cost of capital. It improves access to capital on the equity side. It improves your leasing. We've yet to find a reason why people shouldn't be doing this, with the caveat being, in the U.S., there's an issue around semantics, how people talk about it. People in many cases don't want to talk about it at all. They're still doing it. They just don't want to talk about it. And so green hushing, which I didn't think much about, we see a lot of clients basically doing that. And our clients span the whole spectrum from, quite left of center to, to the right of almost everybody. But they're still doing it because it impacts the value of their business one way or another.
That was Brad Doxer talking to Monocle's Andrew Tuck at MIPIM. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, a music venue can often define a city's sound at a particular moment in history. For Rio de Janeiro, Circo Voador is one such venue, becoming so intertwined with decades of Brazilian music that it recently gained intangible cultural heritage status. Well, here, Monocle contributor Thomas Pinheiro tells us how Rio's flying circus has evolved throughout its history.
Recently designated as an intangible cultural heritage of Rio de Janeiro, the legendary concert venue Circo Voador, or the Flying Circus, has a rocky history that intertwines with the modern era of Brazilian music. Circo Voador first landed in a prime patch of real estate, Arpoador, the scenic peninsula between Ipanema and Copacabana neighborhoods. The year was 1982, and Brazil's military rule was beginning to crack. Circo, as it quickly became known, was born from the desire for free expression, a community-driven space whose program varied from capoeira workshops to theatrical and musical performances. With censorship loosening its grip, a group of artists pitched the idea to city officials, who granted them a month-long tenure. 3 months on, despite objections from affluent neighbors, the temporary stage remained in place. Sheltered by a deep blue tarp dusted with stars, the structure indeed looked like a circus. Inside, experimentation was the norm. During this brief, almost magical period, names like Blitz, Lobão, Paralamas, and Cazuza took the stage, collaborating and pushing boundaries. Brazilians know these names well. Circo is, arguably, the birthplace of Brazilian rock. When the time finally came for it to be dismantled, the troupe roamed the city, performing mostly for underprivileged communities. Eventually, they found a new permanent home in Lapa, right beside its famous white arches and surrounded by newly planted royal palms. Rio's Bohemian district was, at the time, still derelict and largely overlooked. More than just a launchpad for musicians, Circo also played a role in shaping Lapa into the vibrant culture and nightlife hub it is today. There, the space remained true to its socially engaged ethos. Regular workshops fostered creativity, a vegetable garden took root, and even a kindergarten was established to offer children from Lapa a front row seat to art in the making. And it wasn't just about rock. The venue welcomed an eclectic mix: punk, funk, hip-hop, reggae, new wave, and samba, among others. Sundays took on a different rhythm, drawing crowds for orchestral performances and ballroom dancing. Circo became a true cultural melting pot, the focal point for the city's emerging underground scenes. For promoters, it was never about embracing a single genre, but rather a distinct spirit that defined the lineups. For artists across the spectrum, performing on Circo's stage became a rite of passage. That spirit spread across Brazil. Circo traveled to new territories, particularly those in the northeast, landing in cities like Petrolina, Teresina, and São Luís, far from the more developed south and southeast. It even reached Guadalajara for the 1986 Mexican World Cup, with hundreds of artists aboard a Hercules plane from the Brazilian Air Force. Well into the 90s, this creative energy felt unstoppable. But in 1996, seemingly out of nowhere, Mayor Cesar Maia revoked the venue's license, citing alleged irregularities deemed a risk to the public, including widespread drug use. Rumor had it, however, that his true reason was far more political. His successor and ally, the newly elected Luiz Paulo Conde, had been loudly booed and forced to leave the premises by a group of punk rockers just days earlier. Circo wasn't just shut down, it was demolished, leading to an 8-year hiatus. The closure did not go unopposed. A groundswell of resistance driven by the artistic community and the public at large sparked the SOS Circo Voador movement, which campaigned relentlessly for its revival. High-profile protest concerts and demonstrations swept through the city, culminating in the occupation of the former grounds, where artists reclaimed the space, turning it into an impromptu performance stage, a testament to Circo's enduring spirit. Under mounting pressure, the good news came. and Circo reopened in 2004. Its redesigned structure, befitting the new millennium, was a domed tensile pavilion that evokes the silhouette of a spaceship. The new design is modular and adaptable, allowing for a diverse range of performances and activities, and seamlessly blending indoor and outdoor areas, as if to underscore this institution's democratic spirit. Yet, one detail remained unchanged: the carnival-style marquee lights, spelling out its name in a familiar warm glow, just as they had in the old days. Beneath the white dome of today's Circo, and framed by the now towering palm trees, Brazilian music continues to evolve, and the die-hard fans from the 80s and 90s now mingle with a fresh wave of ticket holders. Safeguarded as an intangible cultural heritage of Rio, Circo's influence is bound to endure for generations to come. In other words, the flying circus shows no signs of a grand finale.
And thanks to Monocle contributor Thomas Pinheiro. For more stories about the cities we live in, don't forget to tune into The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
8:46 in Paris, which is where we head now, because it is time to talk design with Samantha T, writer, editor and consultant who joins us now from the French capital. A very good morning to you, Sam.
Good morning.
How's Paris looking today?
Absolutely stunning. Crisp, grey, but gorgeous.
Gorgeous. Thank you very much indeed for that weather update. Let's talk about design.
Right. Well, it's going to be an exciting time. I mean, we have a lot of design coming through to the city. For Milan Design Week, we have French artist and designer Antoine Boulot, who is collaborating with Parisian fashion designer Marc-Antoine Berrois for an immersive installation to unveil Berrois' newest fragrance during Milan Design Week. So what's going to happen is they're actually going to create an immersive installation that's going to take place at this historic Salone del Tessuti, which is an iconic 1930s Milanese landmark. And it was once central to the city's bustling fabric trade. So it's a great way to give scent and collectible design a space to cross-pollinate. So the venue is going to be transformed into like a dreamlike environment where light sort of breaks in the middle, and it becomes an incredibly beautiful dreamscape. So visitors are going to walk through a mirrored cube at the center of the building, and there's going to be a dense sort of forest of ropes. And it's going to be extremely quiet. And then they're going to sort of walk through this obscure landscape, and they emerge into like this bright clearing, which is going to be the heart of the exhibition. And after it clears, there's going to be this amazing scent, which is going to introduce Berrois' new scent, which is actually really interesting because it's only going to be focused on a single flower, which is the tuberose. And this was created in conjunction with Quentin Biche, who is a very celebrated nose and a longtime collaborator with the brand.
How often is it, just to try and place a little bit of context on this, I mean, how often is it that scent and design actually cross over in this way? I mean, we see this in fashion for decades, but in terms of sort of the more wider issue of design.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, I actually don't see it very often, which is what I think is really great, is that I have seen, a scent in design sort of as almost as an afterthought, if you will. I definitely see it when certain brands are creating installations and they want to make it multisensory. But to have a brand that is specifically fashion and, scent in this case, do an immersive installation to really introduce the brand, not so much. This is also a really great way for Marc-Antoine to be introducing his new foray into collectible design. So inside the exhibition, it's going to be an introduction of a series of collectible design that he's going to be launching, as well as the scent. So it's kind of, it's kind of multi-purpose.
Let's now sort of talk about another marriage of design and other areas of artistic creativity. The Victoria and Albert Museum here in the United Kingdom is no stranger to staging big exhibitions, especially when it comes to fashion and to very, very famous figures. I'm thinking both of Chanel, but also the likes of David Bowie. It's now venturing into showcasing jewellery and its history.
Right. So the V&A is going to be staging its first major exhibition in almost 30 years dedicated to Cartier jewelry and watches. Now, Cartier, of course, is a huge name in jewelry and watches. It's synonymous with glamour and quality and design. So it's going to open on April the 12th, and it's going to feature more than 350 objects. You know, what's really interesting about this exhibition, I think, is that it's going to chart the brand's history, design, and craftsmanship from the turn of the 20th century to modern day. And, you know, their clients have always ranged from, you know, the royalty, royal family, artisans, celebrities, but also to, you know, people who may not have big titles. And the exhibition will include, you know, precious jewels and show-stopping objects, historical gemstones, iconic watches that have been worn, you know, by celebrities across cinema, music, and fashion. And it's going to draw from both the museum's collection as well as previously unseen drawings and also jewels lent by various people, including King Charles himself.
And indeed, we asked the same question as I asked with the last story that you were talking about. Is that crossover of jewellery and design now? Again, I mean, how often do we see that appear?
A lot more than we do with scent. You know, jewelry has always been an extension of a brand. But what I think is really great about Cartier is that, you know, it's a very singular focus. And the singular focus is definitely on design and craftsmanship, you know, and it's across the board, whether it's jewelry, whether it's watches, whether it's custom pieces, or whether it's more commercial pieces. They definitely have that beautiful sort of design edge to them that I think that makes them so special. You know, people, you know, like I said, royalty have been wearing them for decades, for centuries even, you know, for at least the last 100 years, because things that are going to be, you know, some of the highlights of the pieces that are going to be there will include this beautiful diamond brooch commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. And it features a very rare 23.6 carat pink Williamson diamond, you know. And there's also the scroll tiara, which was commissioned in 1902, which was worn to the coronation of Elizabeth II, you know. And they're also going to showcase beautiful pieces worn by Rihanna, you know, who was on the cover of W magazine in 2016. I love the breadth of design that it covers, you know, everyone from, you know, like I said, the Queen to someone who is, you know, the Queen of music, Rihanna.
Thank you so much, Samantha Say, for joining us on the line from Paris. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, the number of copies of the Bible sold in the United Kingdom has almost doubled in the last 5 years. The Bible Society said that its Good News Bible, Youth Edition, was by far the most popular, with extra explanations and space for writing notes. The clue as to who's buying the Bibles is in the name, with the drive in sales coming from young people. Well, I'm joined in the studio now by David Badanis, writer and Bible expert, no less. How many copies of the Bible do you have, David, and why?
I have 7 major translations and volumes of commentary. I've spent over a decade writing a book on the history of the Ten Commandments, where they came from, how they were understood, and how they've been reinterpreted over the millennia.
So you have a natural attraction to this work. What is it do you believe that's making young people so fond of it?
There's a couple of things. One is that some of the sheer storytelling is magnificent. The story of David, King David, my namesake, is just profound. It's magnificent tragedy, and it's crisp, clear writing. People are often surprised at that. A lot of classics that you're supposed to read are not really readable, and clearly there's dull and dreary bits in the Bible, but there's bits that come right to you. He who's without sin cast the first stone. Goes right into your heart. You open to almost a random page and you'll find something that really speaks directly. Better than song lyrics, you might say. That's one. Another one is this dealing objectively with purpose. We have all this stuff to do. As old people lament that young people are, quote unquote, wasting their time on social media, young people are aware of that too, doom scrolling and all that. And here's a book that reminds you of what can be significant. And it's genuine significance. It's not Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate. It's real stuff.
So it is arguably an uncertain world looking for something a little bit more secure to tether to.
I think, so one is there's security. It's like, okay, here's answers. But there's something else. It's speaking to the way that you're feeling. Suppose you have a crummy job or somebody's treated you poorly. You can open parts of the Bible and it speaks directly to you. Oh, you know about suffering? I really know about suffering.
Do you have to be religious, though, to go for this? Because one is wondering whether these the people who are buying the Bible are actually doing it because of the world is becoming more conservative in certain parts, or whether the world is becoming more religious, or indeed whether people are just interested.
Yeah, so I think there will be some who are already conservatively religious, but they'll probably already have Bibles, including old-fashioned translations, which are often a bit misleading. Some of the new translations, I don't know this particular one, the Message Bible in particular, are beautifully written. Really, really, really goes from the essence of ancient Hebrew or Latin of a previous time to our thoughts today. You can follow and get into these things even if you don't believe. A good example is that the pilgrimage walk in northern Spain that many people do. A friend of mine did it recently, and almost everybody who was on the walk, walking for weeks and weeks on end, some of them had been brought up Catholic. Many of them hadn't been at all. Almost the majority of people that my friend met were non-believers. But yet they liked doing something in unison with others where there's at least intrigue with the form. But above all, paying attention to your concerns.
And do we find ourselves going to church more as well, or is this simply something that is happening in the privacy of people's homes?
Now you identified a giant distinction. Church going is low and staying really low. It's going down in almost all religions, except for a few of the evangelicals. And in Britain, even that isn't increasing that much. This is a private matter. This is a matter where you open the book and something touches you. Someone has heard your pain.
This latest edition, or the edition that seems to be going off the shelves faster, is the youth edition, which has extra explanations and space for writing notes. It's a moot point as to how interactive a book should be, but the popularity of something like that suggests what?
Yeah, that actually goes back to how the Bible was originally used. The Bible, at least the Old Testament, was scrolls. It was before printed books. And even when, not printed books, even bound books. Even when bound books began in the Roman Empire era, almost nobody could afford a Bible. There was no printing. And so the Bible would never be a thing that was written at length, that would be read at length. It would be discussed in small amounts. So the notion of making notes back and forth, that's exactly what it was intended for. It's like homilies and discussions.
Finally, in this world of, as you said, doom scrolling, if you were to send us to a religious book, not necessarily the Bible, although you've described that your shelves are chock-a-block with copies, where would you send us?
I would recommend the Message translation of the Bible. I really would. It's very, very readable, and it's not too expensive. And you can browse through it and find interesting bits that talk to you. There's also a translation of the Bible by Jonathan Alter, but it's beautifully done but has long footnotes. He was a wonderful poet and translator. But I would recommend the Message translation. The advantage of that is that then a whole bunch of other literature, either what we consider literature novels or books by philosophers or theologians, then will open up because you're intrigued by that. For one particular one, I'd recommend almost any of the essays of the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And then if for a single novel, I'd strongly recommend the novel Night, N-I-G-H-T, by Elie Wiesel.
David Badanis, thank you so much for joining me in the studio right here on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Hassan Anderson, Laura Kramer and Monica Lillis. Our researcher is Francesca Jilks and our studio manager is Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you for listening.